And if y'all don't chase too many rabbits this evening, we should get through with chapter 30. But we are in the last section of chapter 30, verses 27 through verse 33, that I titled, Judah Rejoices, but Assyrians Destroyed. And Isaiah in this section foretells God's judgment upon the Assyrians, using various figures of his wrath. And then in verse 29, it kind of changes to the aspect of Israel rejoices over it, sings with gladness because of the destruction of the Assyrians. And then in verse 30 and 31, the Lord's voice is going to be heard in that destruction. We'd gotten to verse 32 then. And in every place where the grounded staff shall pass, which the Lord shall lay upon him, it shall be with tablets and harps, and in battles of shaking will he fight with it. If you look at the preceding verse, that through the voice of the Lord, the Assyrian, or shall the Assyrian be beaten down, which smote with the rod. It is expressing that here is the rod of God's wrath, basically beating the Assyrians down. Now, we know historically that God used the Babylonians to do that, but it is dealing with him beating them down. With that, you have verse 32, the grounded staff shall pass. So in every place where the avenging arm of God, where it strikes, it's Yahweh laying on the Assyrians. Dale?
In verse number 30, would that be figurative hailstones like the bricks of the wall falling? They don't say literal anywhere, but you don't have to. They always say literal.
It is using figurative language to express God's judgment and his rage against the Assyrians. In a sense, the Assyrians here are representative of God's enemies. That would be any time, any place. In every age, you have the representative, someone who's God's enemy. And God is going to lay upon him that rod, beating them down. His destruction. Here it's God's avenging arm is represented as his staff, with the Assyrians being the object of that which is smitten. Their destruction, he says, would be with basically tambourines and harps, representing, in this case, the joy of those who have been rescued, God's redeemed people. There would be a rejoicing on their part of the destruction of their enemy. Dale, you want to ask something?
Well, I guess I should know it because I've been studying the Bible for years, but I remember the staff being used for blessings in the New Testament, but I remember the ground of the staff being used for punishment, unless I'm innocent, forgetful.
Staff can be used in various ways. The shepherd's staff, for example, could be used as an object to defend the sheep by beating off animals that would be harmful to them.
Made with bamboo or some tree up.
I don't know.
You don't know?
But it can be used. It could be used to lift up a shepherd or a sheep that had fallen. It could be used to beat off wolves or any other type of animals. So it can be used either way, depending on the purpose at that point in time that he's using it for. Here, he's using it for beating the enemies of God. But an interesting question comes up. Here you have God describing the destruction of the Assyrians. And what's Israel doing? They're rejoicing.
Especially the remnant is.
That's what we're talking about now, the Israelites, the redeemed. They're rejoicing over the destruction of their enemies. Is it right for us today to rejoice over the destruction of our enemies? Well, that would be a time of rejoicing. That's true. Now then, we're speaking from at least right now, from a spiritual standpoint. Those who are forces of evil, when they are destroyed, isn't that a time of rejoicing?
Yeah, there was a lot of rejoicing in Japan. Japanese got to where they couldn't do what they were doing.
You're talking about their spirituality?
No.
Well, that's what we're talking about right now.
Okay. But the spiritual warfare contrasts the physical warfare. What's the time about?
We're talking about spiritual now. The aspect of people who teach false doctrine, who teach error, promote error, when we see their destruction, there's nothing wrong with rejoicing over their destruction of it. That's what you have here. And I'll use the illustration of debates. You have a debate, truth versus error. Sometimes it's error versus error, but we're talking about now truth versus error. And the truth is upheld, and the error is shown to be false and is defeated. Shouldn't we rejoice over that? Now then, of course, it is the desire in those type of situations to convert people to Christ over that, but it's also to prevent the error from being spread. If you utterly destroy that doctrine, then you have prevented others from being led astray by the doctrine. Right. The overturning of Roe v. Wade, yes. And from a spiritual standpoint, it brought back to a certain extent the respect of human life, which God demands. So yes, we can rejoice over times like that. anytime morals are upheld and immorality for lack of a better word, destroyed, then certainly we should rejoice over those things. Just like we should sorrow when error is spread or when error is done. I remember the psalmist stating, "Rivers of water run down my eyes because they keep not thy law." It expresses the sorrow over sin. Well, we should have the sorrow over sin, but we should also rejoice when that sin is defeated. There is sorrow that Paul expresses in Galatians and other books in relationship to people who had apostatized. There's also, from a standpoint, the aspect of amazement that people would apostatize, but those who had apostatized because of the error that was being promoted in that situation, the Judaizing teachers, there would be a sorrow over them apostatizing over that, but also you look at some of the language that Paul uses concerning them. Our translators, in translating the Bible, I hate to use the term, but for lack of a better expression right now, they watered down the language a lot. And so, now then, it's still, if you study the words, you get the idea of the expression that Paul's using about those individuals who are Judaizing teachers. But it is watered down. Dale?
I mean, you can all understand handkerchiefs were taken from Paul's body in Acts 19, 11, and 12. And you know, great time talking and spread the news that all this stuff is being done by this gospel preacher. He's preaching the resurrection. And here these Galatians are not far away are leaving that very gospel that miracles have been performed regarding. Yeah, no wonder he's amazed. What in the world is taking proof stuff these people? You know?
It wasn't proving stuff to them. They had obeyed the gospel already. The problem was they were being led astray by false teachers. And so Paul uses very strong language in condemning the false teachers to their defeat. And so there's nothing wrong with a rejoicing when truth triumphs. And that's what you're seeing here. Their tambourines and harps, those were instruments of joy and just a joyous occasion. Why? Because God is destroying the Assyrians. It's also going to be in battles of shaking will he fight with it. So with the battles of shaking or shocks of battle and fighting against and in punishing the Assyrians. God is also showing in this that the Assyrians' destruction was not some chance event. It was an event that had been decreed by God long before it happened. That this is going to take place, they are going to be destroyed, and so when it is destroyed, shouldn't be any surprise to anyone. It's the action of God. and as a result of his dealings with man, both with his own people, but also with the peoples of the world. So they suffered, or the Assyrians suffered God's wrath because God planned it that way and because they were attacking God and the people of God. Their arrogance, saying that your God can't save you, well, they were wrong. In verse 33 then, for Tophet is ordained of old, yea, for the king it is prepared. He hath made it deep and large. The pile thereof is fire and much wood. The breath of the Lord like stream of brimstone doth kindle it. Tophet. What in the world, or where in the world is Tophet? Well, it's going to be associated with the Valley of Hinnom. It is, according to Gesenius in his lexicon, defined as a place of burning and burying dead bodies. And that was the definition of Tophet. We're going to get to that. Who said that? Okay, one comment. It is associated with the Valley of Hinnom, which later becomes Gehenna. Or, if you can get that, Hinnom and Gehenna, it's basically the same. Now, the Valley of Hinnom were where sacrifices were offered to the idol Molech. If you look in 2 Kings 23 and verse 10, it says, and he defiled Tophet, which is in the valley of the children of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or daughter to pass through the fire to Molech. So this valley of Hinnom, Tophet, is where they would cause the children to pass through the fire and sacrifice to Molech, that idol. Let's just get a couple other verses. Jeremiah 7 and verse 31 says that they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. Just as an aside, in looking at that verse, notice the last two phrases, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. This was something that God did not command, therefore what was it? Well, it was unauthorized, but it was sin. Why? Why was it sin? Because God commanded it not. When God does not command something, then it is sinful. Now then, I'm not going to spend the time going through the ways in which God authorizes by direct statements, examples, and implication, and some would say either explicitly or implicitly, however you want to express that. But if God doesn't authorize it, if he does not command it, it's sinful. Which he commanded not. That it's with Nadab and Abihu. That's in Leviticus 10, 1 and 2. And that's true. He uses the same phraseology. Here he adds, neither came it into my heart. He doesn't use that with Nadab and Abihu, but you have the same idea. He did not command them to use that fire, so what was it? It was sinful, and they died before the Lord because of it. So we see that principle of authority all through the Bible. You also see the principle of silence. When God does not command something, when he doesn't authorize something, then that action is sinful. That's the principle of silence. He's silent about that subject. God was silent about having their children burned with fire. And so it was sinful.
He showed his earlier desires about that by letting a ram take the place of Isaac, showing Abraham that he was just testing him. After the ram appeared, he reached back and offered it in place of Isaac. He said, let Abraham come down with a lion on his son. He already has shown his will on that years before.
Okay. That's.
A lot of people say, well, God didn't say you couldn't. So this is okay. You better not do it.
Here God did not say you cannot, offer your sons and daughters in the fire. He didn't say that. He didn't say, do not do that. So was it all right or was it prohibited? To use the discussion of today, better not do it. It's sinful. And that goes back to, again, what we're talking about, the principle of silence. In Jeremiah 19 and verse 6, therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that this place shall no more be called Tophet, nor the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. And then skip down a few verses in Jeremiah 19 to verse 11. And shalt say unto them, thus saith the Lord of hosts, even so will I break this people and this city, as one breaketh a potter's vessel, that cannot be made whole again. And they shall bury them in Tophet, till there is no place to bury. Sounds like a pretty big slaughter, doesn't it? Now,
Describes that in detail in chapter 8, 1 through 3. Busy
Okay.
dead bodies everywhere, it says.
okay. Again, a pretty big slaughter. This offering of their sons and daughters to Moloch was a Canaanite custom that was adopted by Judah. It amazes me, and I can't think of a stronger word than amazed, so that parents would willingly sacrifice their children to a god and basically burn them to death. And put the baby in it so that the baby would be burned to death. It would not surprise me, but I don't know. Of course, the Egyptians thought everything was God, basically, so that would not surprise me with the Egyptians and casting them to the alligators or anything else. But it just amazes me that a parent could do that with their babies. But no, that's not what they were thinking. That's not what they were thinking, Dale. Because that's not the purpose of it. The purpose of it was to appease the wrath of that God. If they didn't believe that, so quoting that verse would be worthless to them, because they believed this is a God and that's what He demanded. And so they would offer their babies to. Okay, Dale, okay, we understand those are idols, they're not true gods, but that's what the people believed. So it doesn't matter whether they were true or not, that's what they did, because they had to appease the wrath of that God. And if they didn't, then all sorts of evils would come upon them. So what do? Do what they've been taught to do. Sacrifice the baby to their god, Moloch. Now then, while that shocks and amazes us, why? Why should it? Look at what the United States have been doing since the 1970s with Roe v. Wade. And it's done all over the world. United States, 1 to 1.5 million a year, in that range. But if you're talking about worldwide, generally over 50 million a year. Now then, just in the United States, and more recently, if a baby somehow survived that abortion attempt, then what did they do? Killed it. Or let it lay there until it died. Provide absolutely no medical assistance, don't feed it, don't do anything, just let it die. Now, you tell me that we're any better than what they were when we do things like that? And I'm saying we as a nation, not as individuals, but as the nation as a whole. Now, they did it to babies that were alive. We did it to babies in the womb. Now then, again, is there any big difference between the two? Not really, is there? So, God destroyed those nations and destroyed those idols. And you have to wonder how long God's going to tolerate our nation and the nations of the world. This valley of Hinnom, or Tophet here, was later on a place of refuse of Jerusalem that was kept constantly burning day and night, all the time, outside of the gates of Jerusalem for all of their trash, all of their refuse. Would be taken there and it would be able to be burned. Now then, it later, because of that, came to represent hell Gehenna, which describes that place of eternal torment, which would be burning a fire from the eternal nature of God, because that's prepared for the devil and his angels, a place of torment. Now then, there's those brethren, and I can name several of them who have gone this way, who no longer believe that in an eternal torment, a place of we would refer to as hell. It's simply that you cease to exist. Now then, the life, if you're saved, would be eternal. But death, they would express death. What is that? That's ceasing to be. So they cease to exist, an eternal death, and they never come back to life. They never have life again because they are eternally dead. And so there's the discussion that comes up as to this place, Gehenna, or the Valley of Hinnom, which was a place of refuse which burned things up. If someone was in that valley and burned up, they would be ceasing to exist. They would not continue in torment, would they? They would die. And so they try to take that as that's what happens to someone at the second coming of Christ. Those who go into eternal life to be blessed with God, and then you have those who go to eternal death. In other words, they go to an eternal ceasing to exist. I say a lot of brethren have gone that way, began teaching such. One of my teachers at Harding, Jimmy Allen, he used to go all over the country holding huge revivals, citywide things in which huge coliseums would be rented, and he would speak to literally thousands of people. And one of the sermons that made him famous, I'll put it that way, was dealing with hell. And toward the end of his life, he basically changed his view to this ceasing to exist and disavowed that sermon that he preached all over. A person I've quoted in the book of Isaiah many times, Homer Haley. Toward the end of his life, he went that way. And I can name several more, but it's not necessary. But one thing, it seems like it's always toward the end of someone's life. I don't understand why. But this is obviously a place that would represent torment, punishment, eternal fire, in which thus eternal torment would be a person, just as eternal salvation or everlasting life, you would have everlasting death, would be that place of torment. And just as long as the life is, the death is. That's Matthew 25 and verse 46. It is the same. It is the same word, yes. And the Greek. That was the point I was making, Dale. However long the life is, that has to be however long the death is.
Is it something like
And
Aeon, or how, I forget how you spell it now.
Anon. So the pictures of hell, though, are always in the standpoint of it being eternal, an eternal punishment, an eternal torment, where the worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched, for example. So here is a figure of that you start seeing.
When it says the worm died not, isn't that present active predicted, just like 1 John 1:7 and the other verbs that are
I don't know. I would have to go back and look.
followed at one time?
Okay. There's also the idea, yea, for the king it is prepared. The Hebrew word king is the Hebrew word melech, which is the same basic root of Molech, which is the idol that they offered their babies to. Thus, the king, using that same type of figure, shows the nature of those kings. Thus, this valley of Hinnom, or Tophet, was prepared for Molech. And so the new Tophet is prepared for another king, which is the king of Assyria. It was so deep and large that it would accommodate a vast multitude, the destruction of a nation, and a destruction of a military that was as great as Assyria. And there would be the fire and wood waiting for the Lord's breath to kindle it. So it's been prepared for the king of Assyria, this valley or this Tophet. And now then it's just waiting for the Assyrian king and his soldiers and eventually the nation. So thus it is a place symbolizing the funeral of the Assyrian army and its king. And it's not a very pretty picture as far as that funeral is concerned. Any questions or comments? See, I told you if y'all didn't chase too many rabbits, we'd finish chapter 30.
One thing I read here is that it comes from the word coat, or drum, from the drums you used to beat.
That's Toph does. And many believe that that is the origin of instrumental music in worship.
You mean Tophet is? Really?
It was the beating of drums, musical instruments, in their worship to their god Molech, but the instruments were being used to drown out the cries of the babies that were being offered. I mean, they're being burned. What's a baby going to do? Scream as long and as loud as they can. Same thing that we would do. And so the drums, beating of the drums, would drown out their cries. And so you have the origin of an instrument being used in worship to a god, Molech. And thus that's the origin of instrumental music, thus in worship. Now then, as far as Christian, I'm using that in the world standard. It doesn't come about until, the 6th century in Roman Catholicism. And during the Protestant Reformation, just about all of the Protestant reformers condemned it greatly, much stronger terms than a lot of members of the church would use and preachers would use. It was something that was strongly condemned by them. But the origin of it goes back to this: instruments being played in worship to drown out the crying and the cries of the babies that were being offered and sacrificed to Molech.
Hurt their conscience. They didn't want to hear it anymore, so they drowned it out.
Well, I would admit, they did not want to hear the crying out of the babies as they were screaming and crying, because of the pain that they were in. But who would want to really hear that? Next time we'll start with chapter 31 then.